Olivia Parker's hands were steady, her pulse quick but controlled as she pressed down on the man's chest. The rain poured around them, soaking her scrubs as she performed CPR in the middle of the dimly lit street. The stranger's expensive suit was torn, his face pale, but she refused to let him slip away. "Come on," she muttered under her breath, pushing against his chest with measured force. "Breathe." A shallow gasp tore from his lips, and Olivia's heart leapt. His eyelids fluttered before slowly lifting, revealing piercing blue eyes that locked onto hers in raw confusion. Relief flooded her as she pulled back, panting from exertion. "You're okay," she assured him, brushing wet strands of hair from her face. "Just stay still." The sound of approaching sirens filled the night air. The man groaned, wincing as he tried to move. Olivia quickly placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Don't, you were unconscious, you need to be checked out." His gaze remained fixed on her, as if trying to piece together what had happened. "You saved me." His voice was raspy but deep, commanding even in his weakened state. "Yes," she answered, her voice softer now. Up close, she noticed the sharp cut of his jaw, the way the rain clung to his dark hair. He had an air of power about him, even lying on the pavement. The paramedics arrived moments later, pushing past Olivia as they assessed him. She stepped back, watching as they secured him onto a stretcher. One of the paramedics turned to her. "You were the first responder," Olivia nodded. "You did good. He wouldn't have made it without you." She exhaled, the weight of the moment settling in. As they loaded him into the ambulance, the man's gaze found her once more. There was something unreadable in his eyes, something that sent an unexpected jolt through her. Then the doors closed and he was gone. 2 weeks passed. Olivia had nearly forgotten about the man she saved, at least she had tried to, but something about that night lingered in her mind. She had no idea who he was, only that he had been wearing a watch that probably cost more than her entire year's salary. She was finishing up a long shift at the hospital when a nurse poked her head into the break room. "Olivia, someone's here asking for you." Frowning, she set down her coffee and made her way to the front desk. Standing there, looking completely out of place among the sterile white walls, was the man from that night. He was no longer battered and unconscious. Now he was dressed in a tailored navy suit, his posture straight, his presence powerful. Those same piercing blue eyes met hers, but this time they weren't filled with confusion. They were watching her with intent. "You," Olivia breathed, caught off guard. A slow, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I had to find you." Her heart pounded. "Why?" He took a step closer, his voice dropping just enough to send a shiver down her spine. "Because you saved my life." "And I don't even know your name," she swallowed, trying to ignore the way her pulse spiked. "Olivia." "Olivia Parker. Jacob Kingston." The name rolled off his tongue effortlessly, but Olivia didn't miss the way heads turned at the mention of it, her brows furrowed. The name sounded vaguely familiar. "You're someone important, aren't you?" A flicker of amusement danced in his gaze. "Something like that." Before she could press for more, he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a sleek black card. "I want to thank you properly, Olivia." He extended it to her. "Have dinner with me." She hesitated, glancing at the card. It wasn't just any business card, it bore the name of one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. "I don't need a thank you," she said carefully. "I was just doing my job." Jacob tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Then consider it a personal request." No strings attached. Something about the way he said it made it impossible to refuse. Against her better judgment, she took the card. "All right," she said finally. "One dinner." His smile deepened, and for the first time, Olivia had a feeling she had just stepped into something far more complicated than she realized. Olivia stood outside the restaurant, staring up at its gleaming golden sign. She had never set foot in a place like this before, where the valet service alone looked more expensive than her monthly rent. She clutched her purse, inhaling sharply before stepping inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, she was enveloped in an atmosphere of quiet opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the sleek marble floors. Soft piano music floated through the air, blending seamlessly with the low murmur of conversation. Every table was adorned with pristine white linens and delicate floral arrangements. A host in an impeccably tailored suit greeted her with a knowing nod, as if he had been expecting her. "Right this way, miss." She followed him through the restaurant, acutely aware of the glances she was drawing. Dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, she felt out of place among the women draped in designer gowns and men who exuded effortless power. Then she saw him. Jacob sat at a secluded table by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline stretching behind him. He looked completely at ease, a glass of deep red wine resting between his fingers. But as soon as he spotted her, something shifted in his expression and intensity that made her pulse quicken. He stood as she approached, his presence commanding without effort. Olivia. Her name sounded different coming from him, like he was testing how it felt on his tongue. She slid into the chair opposite him, trying to steady herself. "This place is extravagant." A subtle amusement flickered in his gaze. "Only the best." A waiter appeared almost instantly, pouring her a glass of wine before retreating without a word. Olivia lifted an eyebrow. "Do they just know what I want?" Jacob's lips curved slightly. "I may have made a suggestion." She studied him, unsure what to make of him. There was an ease to the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that wasn't just about wealth, it was something deeper, something ingrained. "You never told me why you were in the street that night," she said, breaking the silence. He leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping against the stem of his glass. "Business meeting ran late. I was on my way home when a car came out of nowhere." His gaze darkened for a fraction of a second before settling back on her. "Next thing I knew, I woke up to you." She swallowed, remembering the way his eyes had searched hers that night, the way his life had hung in the balance. "I'm glad I was there," she admitted. His expression softened just slightly. "So am I." The conversation drifted from there, flowing more easily than Olivia expected. He asked about her work, her long shifts, the exhaustion that came with saving lives. She found herself surprised by how attentively he listened, how he seemed genuinely interested. And then, when she finally turned the question back on him when she asked what he did, he hesitated for the first time. "I run a company," he said simply. She narrowed her eyes. "That's vague," he exhaled as if contemplating how much to reveal. "Kingston Enterprises." The name sent a jolt through her. She had heard of it, of course, everyone had. It was one of the most powerful corporations in the country, spanning industries from finance to technology. Her fingers tightened around her glass. "You're the CEO." His gaze never wavered. "Yes." A beat of silence stretched between them. Jacob Kingston wasn't just wealthy, he was one of the most influential men in the world, and she had saved his life without knowing any of it. Something in her chest tightened. "This is a lot," she admitted. He tilted his head slightly. "Does it change anything?" She searched his face, trying to decipher what he was asking. It wasn't just about his wealth or status, it was something more. "No," she said finally, "it doesn't." And for the first time that night, his expression shifted into something unreadable. The air between them shifted. Olivia could feel it, a subtle tension threading through the conversation, something unspoken lingering beneath Jacob's composed exterior. She wasn't naive. A man like him, with that much power and wealth, undoubtedly lived in a world far removed from hers. Yet, sitting across from him now, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like he wanted her here. The waiter returned, setting down plates of perfectly plated in trays. Olivia barely glanced at hers. Her mind was still racing, trying to process everything. Jacob Kingston, CEO. A man who probably had a team of people managing every aspect of his life. And yet, he had personally sought her out, insisted on this dinner. She picked up her fork, forcing herself to focus. "So what happens now?" Jacob studied her, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean? You found me, you thanked me." "Is that it?" She met his gaze, searching for an answer. For a moment he didn't respond, then he leaned forward slightly, his voice lower. I don't think it is. Her pulse quickened. She hadn't expected that. Jacob cut into his food, his movements slow, deliberate. I don't do things halfway, Olivia. When something matters to me, I don't just walk away from it. Something about the way he said it, calm, certain, sent a shiver through her. She took a sip of her wine, steadying herself. I'm not sure what you're expecting. I'm not expecting anything, he said smoothly. But I know when I want to see someone again. She should have been intimidated, maybe she was, just a little. But beneath the weight of his words, there was something else: intrigue, curiosity, a pull she couldn't quite ignore. Are you always this direct? She asked. A flicker of amusement crossed his face. Only when it matters, she exhaled, setting her glass down. You don't even know me. His gaze didn't waver. I know enough. The way he said it made her skin warm. It wasn't just a line. It was a statement, a certainty that unsettled and fascinated her in equal measure. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of conversation, each exchange revealing more than she had expected. Jacob asked about her life, her dreams, what had led her to become a nurse. He listened, really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak, but absorbing every word, every nuance. And in return, he offered glimpses into his own world. The pressures of running an empire, the weight of expectation, the loneliness that came with it. He didn't complain. Jacob Kingston didn't seem like the kind of man to indulge in self-pity, but there was an honesty in his words that caught her off guard. By the time they stepped outside, the night air was cool against her skin. Jacob's driver was already waiting, the sleek black car idling by the curb. He turned to her, his presence commanding even in the quiet of the street. Let me take you home. She hesitated. Not because she didn't trust him, but because everything about this night had been unexpected. I'll be fine, she said. It's not far. Jacob studied her for a moment before nodding. But he didn't move, didn't turn away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, elegant card. My personal number. If you ever need anything. She took it, the weight of the gesture settling over her. Good night, Olivia, he said, his voice softer than before. She watched as he stepped into the car, the door closing behind him. And as she walked away, the card pressed between her fingers, she realized something. Jacob Kingston wasn't just a man she had saved. He was a man she might not be able to walk away from. Olivia hadn't expected to hear from Jacob again so soon, but less than 24 hours after their dinner, a sleek black car pulled up outside the hospital, just as her shift ended. She barely had time to process before the driver stepped out, opening the door as if this were routine. Mr. Kingston asked me to pick you up, the man said smoothly. Her heart stuttered. She should have been annoyed at the boldness of it, but instead, she found herself hesitating for a different reason because she wanted to get in. And so she did. Inside, Jacob was waiting, leaned back against the leather seat, his gaze locking onto hers the moment she settled beside him. I was going to call, he admitted, his voice low, steady. But I figured this would be more persuasive. Olivia huffed a laugh, shaking her head. You don't do things halfway, do you? He didn't deny it. Instead, he reached into the console between them, retrieving a small velvet box. Without a word, he handed it to her. She blinked. What is this? A thank you. She hesitated before carefully lifting the lid. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, the kind that was understated yet impossibly elegant. The kind that belonged on someone who lived in his world, not hers. Jacob, this is too much. It's not. His tone left no room for argument. You saved my life, Olivia. No amount of gratitude will ever be enough. Her fingers brushed over the cool metal, emotions twisting inside her. It wasn't just the gift, it was what it represented. But before she could say anything else, he took the bracelet from her hands and fastened it around her wrist himself. The gesture was intimate, deliberate, his fingers lingering just a second longer than necessary. When he looked back up at her, there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch something deeper than gratitude. I want to see where this goes, he admitted, his voice quieter now. Her heart pounded. She had felt the pull between them from the start, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. Despite every logical reason to walk away, she found herself nodding. Okay. Jacob's lips parted slightly, as if he had been preparing for more resistance. Then, just as quickly, his expression shifted into something softer, something unmistakably satisfied. He lifted her hand, pressing a slow, deliberate kiss to the inside of her wrist, right where her pulse thrummed wildly against his lips. And just like that, Olivia knew there was no turning back. The next few weeks unfolded in a way Olivia never could have predicted. She and Jacob fell into an effortless rhythm late-night conversations that stretched until dawn, stolen moments between her shifts, and an undeniable pull that neither of them tried to resist. Jacob was unlike anyone she had ever known. He was confident, decisive, and used to getting his way, but never in a way that made her feel overshadowed. Instead, he had a way of making her feel seen, as if every word she spoke was worth listening to. Every thought she had was something he wanted to understand. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift at the hospital, she stepped out into the cool night air, exhaustion weighing heavy on her limbs. Her plan had been simple: go home, collapse into bed, and sleep until her next shift. But instead, she found Jacob waiting for her. He stood by his car, dressed in a crisp dark suit, his posture relaxed but his expression intent. As soon as he saw her, something in his gaze softened. "You look exhausted," he noted. She let out a tired laugh. "That's because I am." Without another word, he opened the car door. "Come with me." Olivia hesitated. "Jacob, I don't have the energy for anything extravagant tonight." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "I know, just trust me." And she did. The drive was quiet, almost soothing, the hum of the engine lulling her into a rare moment of peace. When they arrived, she realized he hadn't taken her to some high-end restaurant or exclusive event. Instead, they were at a private penthouse his. The space was breathtaking floor-to-ceiling windows, offering an unobstructed view of the city, sleek modern furniture that somehow still felt warm, and a sense of quiet that wrapped around her like a cocoon. Jacob led her to the living room, where a plush couch awaited, and gestured for her to sit. "Stay here." Too tired to argue, she sank into the cushions, letting her head rest back against the soft fabric. She heard him moving in the kitchen, the clinking of glass, the quiet rustle of something being unwrapped. A few minutes later, he returned, carrying a steaming mug. "Chamomile," he said simply, handing it to her. She took it, warmth seeping into her fingers. "You made me tea." He sat beside her, his expression calm. "You take care of everyone else, Olivia." "Let me take care of you." Something in her chest tightened. She had spent years looking after others, her patients, her friends, even strangers, but no one had ever stopped to do the same for her. She took a sip, letting the warmth settle inside her. "Thank you." Jacob didn't say anything, but when she glanced at him, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Something had shifted between them, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what came next. Olivia didn't know when she drifted off, but when she opened her eyes, the city skyline had darkened even further, the soft glow of the penthouse's ambient lighting casting long shadows. A weight settled over her, a warmth she hadn't expected. Jacob had pulled a throw blanket over her at some point, and the realization sent a quiet ache through her. He had let her sleep. She shifted slightly, and that was when she noticed him. He was still beside her, but this time he wasn't just watching, he had fallen asleep too. His head rested against the back of the couch, his usually sharp features softened by the quiet of the night. It was a rare sight, and she couldn't help but stare. Jacob Kingston, the man who commanded boardrooms and wielded power effortlessly, looked almost peaceful. Careful not to wake him, she sat up, adjusting the blanket. But before she could stand, his voice, still heavy with sleep, broke the silence. "Leaving already?" She turned, finding those piercing blue eyes on her, their usual intensity softened by drowsiness. I should go, she whispered, though the words felt hollow. Jacob shifted, straightening but not moving away. Stay, it wasn't a question, it wasn't an order either, it was an offering. A part of her wanted to resist, to remind herself that this wasn't her world, that staying meant stepping deeper into something she wasn't sure she was ready for. But another part of her, the part that had felt his quiet care, the part that had seen the way he had let his guard down around her, wanted to say yes. She exhaled. Just for a little while. Jacob didn't push. Instead, he stood, offering his hand. She hesitated for half a second before taking it, the warmth of his palm against hers sending a quiet thrill through her. He led her toward the large windows, where the city stretched out endlessly before them. The lights flickered like stars, the hum of distant traffic filling the silence. I don't do this, he admitted after a long moment, letting people in. She turned her head slightly, watching him. Why? His jaw tensed as if he was debating whether to answer. Because in my world, trust is a liability, and most people aren't what they seem. She considered that. It made sense. A man like him, powerful, wealthy, would be surrounded by people who wanted something. Whether it was for business, status, or influence, there were always ulterior motives, but she wasn't one of them. I don't want anything from you, Jacob. The words left her before she could second-guess them. His gaze flickered to hers, something unreadable in his expression. I know. And somehow, that single acknowledgement felt heavier than anything else he had said. They stood there, side by side, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable but charged with something neither of them had fully spoken aloud. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Jacob turned to her, his hand still loosely holding hers. I want more than just a few stolen moments, Olivia. His voice was steady, but there was something raw beneath it. I want you in my life. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest. This was real. This wasn't just a man intrigued by a woman who had saved his life. This wasn't just a billionaire indulging in something fleeting. This was Jacob Kingston laying himself bare in a way she doubted he did for anyone. And she knew, without a doubt, that she wanted him too. She squeezed his hand, her throat tight with emotions she wasn't sure how to put into words. I'm here, she whispered. Jacob exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for her answer. Then, without hesitation, he closed the distance between them, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that left no room for doubt. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't desperate, it was a promise. And for the first time in a long time, Olivia knew exactly where she belonged.